Next step is thinking about how play and culture interact with one another. So before we start talking about cultural differences in children's play, it's important to get a few different definitions down. So on this slide, we're going to define race, culture, and ethnicity. So first, let's talk about race. So all people are born with different physical characteristics, and at one point in our history, people took those physical characteristics and decided that they mean something about the groups that people are in. So they took people with similar physical characteristics and arbitrarily placed them into different social groups. And they used things like skin color and particular physical features. So in our country, we have the categories of race of Asian, Black, White, American Indian or Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. So again, that is just back in the day, somebody's looked around and said there's a bunch of people who have similar physical characteristics and we'll all lump them together and put them into one particular group. It doesn't say anything about what those people believe, what they are like on the inside, what's important to them, what skills and abilities they have. It literally is just looking at people's physical characteristics and placing them into groups based on that. Ethnicity is taking things that people have in common and not so much beliefs and values and those kinds of things, but taking people who live in particular similar geographic regions who likely speak the same language and have perhaps shared customs and ideas about how the world works based on where they're geographically from. So ethnicity is more about sort of what area of the world you're from and what religion is predominant in that area, what language is predominant in that area, what values and beliefs are prominent in that area. Again, we can't assume that everyone from that particular ethnicity thinks exactly the same or does things exactly the same, but we're going to group people together based on the possibility that due to living in a particular place, there's some sort of shared identity, language, etc. So with regard to ethnicity, it has slight overlap with race, but not always. So typically when we're talking about ethnicity in the United States, we're talking about Asian Americans, African Americans, Afro-Caribbean Americans, and Hispanic Latino Americans, and then not those things, Americans. And what I want to emphasize is that both of these are social constructs or groups decided upon by people, and then those people put other people into categories based on what they perceive to be similarities and or differences. So it is not something that is innate in people themselves. It is something that has been socially constructed. And culture is taking things that people might have in common, whether it be through race or ethnicity or something else, and naming a particular culture based on those things. So in America, we have people of many different races and many different ethnicities. So there are people who look physically different from one another. There are people from different places in the world who may speak different languages or have different religious backgrounds or different shared values based on their country of origin or their region of the world of origin. And they have all come together to be in the United States of America. And so America, even though it is made up of people of many races and many ethnicities, does have some cultural values that cut across all of us. So in the United States, people primarily speak English, or English is kind of the language of cultural capital, the one that sort of you got to have a little bit of it to get by. We are kind of jokey people. We like to tease and be a little ornery. We value work, lots of work. We're a very work-oriented family. We have particular child-rearing things that we think are kind of macro culture appropriate. There's sort of American clothing styles. So even though we all come from different places and may have slightly different values, we can kind of think of this macro American culture. So hopefully that kind of helps define a little bit about these three terms and how they have some relation to one another, but that they're slightly different. So we're going to be talking about how these kind of three things play out in children's play. When we are thinking about cultural influences on children's play, we're going to look at that through the lens of the adults in their lives, their peers, the time that they're living in, and the context. Context is like the school or the neighborhood, media. So that's sort of our contextual life, is sort of what land we're situating in. So we're going to look at all these different influences and how culture factors into that, and how that ultimately relates to different ways that children might play with each other. So in thinking about adult influences, and we'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, but I did want to bring up a theorist, scholar in the area of culture and children's development. Her name is Barbara Rogoff. And so she developed a theory, a way of thinking about how adults influence children's development and the kinds of activities that they engage in. So she is like Vygotsky. She is a sociocultural theorist. So Vygotsky believed that children's development is best understood by examining their relationships with others in the context of the culture that they live in. And Barbara Rogoff also thought that as well. So you can see where it says Rogoff focuses on learning within cultural contexts rather than isolated individual processes. So basically she's saying you cannot understand a child's development if you take them out of their cultural context. It won't really make sense. So she also talked about the idea of guided participation. So this would be related to Vygotsky's scaffolding, so that children learn when they are interacting with others in some sort of shared activity, and that by having adults who know more, can do more, interact with children during those moments, that adults are able to guide children and help them to learn the things that they need to learn to participate in the society that they live in. She also talked about apprenticeship in thinking. So this would be more related to Bandura. So the idea that we learn from watching. So Barbara Rogoff spent much of her time studying children in spaces where children are learning actual skills. So she was less interested in sort of Western children's play and more interested in children's activities in villages and spaces where children are expected to do fairly adult tasks rather early. So learning to weave and learning to fish and learning to grow fruits and vegetables. And so she realized that children in those kinds of spaces and cultural contexts spend a lot of time watching adults doing things. And so they watch and they learn, and then they try, and then a more skilled other helps them and guides them, and then they watch some more. So it really is like an apprentice, where you go to work with somebody every day and you watch what they're doing, and then they help you to be able to do that independently. So the other piece of hers is this participatory appropriation, and then finally we'll talk about impact. But participatory appropriation is that when you're an apprentice, you are watching what the adult is doing and you're learning how to do the thing that the adult is doing, but generally we don't ultimately do things exactly how the adult who taught us does it. We make our own little adjustments, we put our own little spin on things, and so across time, how tasks are done changes based on the individual who's doing it, because we all have our own slightly different way of making things happen. And so we are both learning in the cultural context and we are changing the cultural context by virtue of our participation. It's very much like when we were talking about theories earlier in the class, and we were talking about how children are both in the culture that they live in, but they're also contributing to the culture by virtue of their activities. And then finally, Rogoff really is talking about how if we want to have the most advantageous kinds of educational programs for young children, even if they're not in this more natural context of learning how to do these kinds of tasks, that these are principles that we can and should apply to our educational context because they work very well in these other kinds of contexts. If children learn to be very skilled fishermen by the time they are teenagers and young adults, and they learn how to weave intricate, complex patterns. So children are capable of very high level things, and maybe we should employ more of these practices in our traditional school-based settings as well. So I do also want to note that I'm giving you some examples of how culture impacts play, but I would also very much encourage you to look at Chapter 7 in your Frost, Wortham, and Rifle textbook. You will find many more examples of cultural differences related to how adults play with children and how children play with each other, etc. But I'm going to give you a few additional examples here on these slides. So one thing that we notice through research is that when we compare children from Asian ethnic backgrounds to those from Western backgrounds, so we're talking about ethnicity here, we're not talking about race, we're talking about ethnicity and how children in Asian backgrounds may differ from children in Western backgrounds. We find that pretend play is less common among Korean Americans than Anglo Americans. So even in that macro American culture, we see some ethnic differences. So we see that Korean Americans don't engage in pretend play as often as children of Anglo Americans, and that when dramatic play is happening, that Anglo American children tend to use more fantastical and danger-oriented themes, whereas Korean American children might be more likely to do those family roles and family kind of play. Another difference is that Asian American parents spend more time on academic-related activities and less time playing in fantasy play with their children than do white parents. So these are some examples, and again, I would encourage you to look at the textbook for more examples of how adults play with their children in various places around the world. Children's peer play also differs depending on where they're situated in terms of culture, ethnicity, race, etc. So we know that children who are from larger families or children who tend to live in smaller, more rural farming kinds of communities tend to have access to larger groups of children to play with that are multi-age and gender diverse. So when kids are in big families, in small communities, rural communities, they tend to have big groups of friends, lots of access to lots of different kids that are lots of different ages and cuts across gender. Whereas children who live in urban areas or in large towns tend to play only with children of their same age and are often more split into gender strict groupings. And a lot of this is because they're not playing with children so much in neighborhoods and other people's homes and in parks. A lot of their access to play tends to happen in daycare centers or in classrooms, and we know that daycare centers and classrooms separate children by age, and we've already talked about the fact that we tend to promote gender typical play and playing with particular kinds of toys depending on what gender you are. So it is not surprising that children are playing in more gender segregated groups when they're not out sort of freely roaming neighborhoods and in more less restrictive spaces. The time you grow up in matters. So childhood has changed a lot. Not to tell you too much about how old I am, but I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and it's a very different land than it is now. We hung out outside of our houses a lot, and I grew up not in a small town, rural area. I grew up in a urban area with, I didn't grow up in the city, but I grew up in an urban area and I did not have a huge giant family, and we played in the neighborhood all the time with all different kids of all different ages. There wasn't anything to do indoors, so we didn't really stay indoors very much. But since the 1980s, play has changed a lot. What children have access to time-wise has changed a lot. So we know from data collected that since the 80s, children have less time to engage in unstructured play and recess when they're at school. So recess has been significantly cut down in schools across the country. There's just not as much time to just hang out in your neighborhood or at a park and just play. Many kids, like we saw in the Where Did the Children Play video, are kind of shuttled around from activity to activity. School focuses way more on academics than it did once upon a time. We're pushing kids harder and harder at earlier ages and having very high expectations in terms of the academic content that they're supposed to be meeting. We'll talk about this more in our Barriers to Play lecture. That's our last lecture for the class. Screen time has definitely increased. I'm sure that in your own lifetime you see the realities of this as well, that there's screens everywhere. You can't get away from them. Mental health concerns are on the rise. The American Academy of Pediatrics, for the first time a couple years ago, declared like a mental health emergency for young people in our country. Anxiety and depression are at all-time highs with children 18 and under. So lots of not so positive things that have happened since the 80s. I would encourage you to read more about these time influences on the links that I've provided. But I did want to also note that California is trying to do something to protect the right of children to play and protecting their time to engage in recess-related activity at school. The last context to talk about is school. And here I wanted to do a little bit of outside of the US information. So I wanted you to look at videos that show you what early childhood looks like in China and what it looks like in Japan, so that you can get a sense of how things might differ. Either before or after you watch these videos, I would like you to also complete the Padlet of what does play look like in American kindergartens. So what do you think kindergartners are doing, and what are kindergartners in these other programs doing? So what are kids in other countries doing that might be different than ours? I think you'll be surprised. I think that we have a conception that children in Asian countries are working, and they're super heavy academics and there's no time for play. And actually in recent years, much of the research on the importance of play has come from other countries, particularly China, and many of the play-based scholars that exist in our early childhood world are from Asian countries, China being kind of first and foremost. So there is a lot more play than I think that you think there is, and I will tell you that there's very little play in American kindergartens. So I'm curious to see what you write on the Padlet, and I'm curious to see what your responses to these two videos are. So really the bottom line, and again, I've given you a couple examples. There's a lot more information in your textbook, in the Frost, Wortham, and Rifle textbook, but it is very clear that culture influences and permeates children's play in terms of many things. So some of them we've talked about previously, and some of it is new on this slide. So one, how much time do children get to play? How much time are they allowed to be in free play, unstructured play, hanging out by themselves in recess? What kind of materials do we give children access to? Do we give them access to play materials at all? If we do, for how long? If we do, are they allowed to do with what they want with those materials, or are they told what to do? Are there limits to who's allowed to play in a particular area? Do you have to share before you're actually done using something? Are the materials developmentally appropriate? Do they demonstrate a good understanding of what children know and can do at particular ages? Are they high quality? Are they gender neutral? Do they influence various areas of development? Are they able to be used outside? What kinds of social groups do we expect to be interacting with those materials? Are they open to children of all races, ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, ability statuses, gender orientations? Are they, 100% accessible in all the ways that we want them to be? Do they invite children who are different from one another to come play together? Child-rearing attitudes and practices. So how do we as adults navigate childhood? Do we think that play is important? Do we see it as valuable? Do we see it as a waste of time? Do we see it as something that you only get to do as a reward for doing your hard work or your academic work? Or do we see it as the primary learning vehicle for young children, particularly when they're in school spaces? What kind of values do we have? Do we think that childhood is to be protected? Do we believe that children should get to lean into this experience and moment in their lives, or are we trying to hurry them along to the next thing? So I would encourage you to watch the video on this slide. It tells you more about sort of how adults and our own attitudes and beliefs and values might bleed into and impact the way in which children are allowed to play and the opportunities that they have. That sort of touches on the next point on this slide about the opportunities that we give children access to. Sports are great, but are we putting children in sports super early? Are we expecting them to follow the rules and stand there for long periods of time while they wait for their turn to participate in the sport activity? Are we shuttling them again from place to place and not allowing them a whole lot of free time? What are we doing at school? Are we in front of the room standing and talking the whole time and not allowing children to ever touch, do, create, determine what the problem is and try and find a solution to it? So you're both cultural background personally, which may be related to your own ethnicity, it likely permeates how you play, but also the more macro American culture that we exist in as people who live in the United States of America also bleeds into and permeates the ways in which children are able to and allowed to play. And so if we agree, as I hope you do, that we should be bringing all children to the table despite their racial, ethnic, or cultural backgrounds, beliefs, values, experiences, and that all children should learn more about each other, and that diversity in our spaces is beautiful and meant to be celebrated and something that we should enjoy and promote. I would encourage you to think about how to develop play opportunities and experiences for children that allow them to do so. So one, take a look at your own cultural values and beliefs and the macro American culture that we exist in, and think about how it may or may not be a good fit for the children in your classroom. And if it's more narrow than your classroom population suggests, how you can expand that. Get to know the kids that you're working with, get to know their families, get to know what's important to them, get to know what language they speak at home and what foods they eat and what celebrations they hold near and dear and how those are navigated. And make sure that you are representing all of them in your classroom activities and materials. So I'm showing you examples of books. So books are a great place to start in terms of making your classroom inclusive and representative, but there are baby dolls that are different genders and abilities. And um, there are cultural foods that you can bring in. There's housekeeping items that differ from each other. There's building materials that might be different. There's art styles that are applicable to particular groups. So anything that you can do to um, bring in things that are related to other people and broaden children's experiences is a wonderful thing. There's all kinds of good stuff out there on what you can do, and I would encourage you to take a look at the links on this page. And then one thing I did want to point out also is just thinking about how you personally interact with children. Unfortunately, there's a lot of data to show that teachers treat certain children very differently and engage in more harsh discipline practices with some groups of children versus others. So boys tend to have their behavior analyzed more critically and are more likely to be punished, suspended, and expelled, as are children of color, as are children with disabilities. So I assure you this is data that is out and about and easy to find, and it does not matter the color, gender, background of the teacher. All teachers seem to treat children of color, boys, and children with disabilities more harshly than they do other children. So we really want to think about how we can reduce those guidance disparities and treat everyone with kindness and respect and inclusiveness.